Hi, welcome back. This is the second of two talks I put together for the IIUG. Rather than introducing myself again, I will skip quickly through these first 6 slides where I talk about myself and 4Js. If you want to read them in more detail, simply pause the video. If you want to hear what I had to say about myself, find my presentation, Transforming the System from Informix 4GL to Genero, the many options and first steps, and watch the opening introductions. Now for the fun ending part of today's talks. This is a lot shorter presentation. I'm probably going to make it a longer presentation at our next WWDC, our Worldwide Developer Conferences, which I'm going to have to start organising soon. This presentation is titled Wordle for Genero, and its starting point is this. This slide contains selected quotes from the Wikipedia article about the Wordle game. Wordle is a web-based word game created and developed by a Welsh software engineer, Josh Wardle. Wardle initially created the game for himself and his partner to play. The game was purchased by the New York Times company in January 2022 for an undisclosed 7-figure sum. Now, if you're like me and you have a significant other, who has heard this story, and she said to me, "Why don't you write me a game we can play?" Or what she really meant is, why don't you write an app you can sell to the New York Times for a 7-figure sum? Or alternatively, to get the same amount, why don't you write an app you can put on the app stores and sell 1 million copies? You can try answering my skills are in developing business applications, but it's not the same. Anyway, what I thought is, what I can do is write a Wordle equivalent using Genero, and use that as a vehicle to showcase some of the syntax and functionality that 4Js has added to Genero over the last 20 years. Hopefully it is a fun and different way of emphasizing that Genero has come a long way in the 20 years since its launch. Now if you go and use Genero and write a viral web or a mobile app, that's better, but I'm not promoting Genero as a game development platform. Our focus is on business applications. But what I want you to see is the code and functionality I'm using to help illustrate that our product has grown a lot from its Informix 4GL base. Code for today's example can be found in our GitHub repository, github.com/4jsgenero. This particular repository has the name app_Wordle. We use GitHub to make some interesting examples of our code public. We have a good library. If we create a good library or a good demo and we think others should see it, this is where we put it. What I will do is go through a series of slides with topics that I want to raise. And then at the end, I will do a demo looking at all the various points. First thing you're going to need if you're going to write a Wordle game is a list of 5-letter words. I'm not going to certainly write them out hand by hand. Well, firstly, it turns out that Wordle has a lot of client-side logic. It's not dependent upon communication with a back-end server. It does not send you a guess back to Wordle servers to see if it is a valid word or how many letters you have right. The list of valid words can be found within its web page sources. Secondly, when dealing in web technologies, this is a skill you will need if you ever get into Genero browser client customization, which is where you can modify the web sources that render our front end. The skill you need is to interrogate a web page and see what source is making it up. So that involves using Google Chrome or whatever web browser you're using. It'll have a functionality that Google Web Chrome calls Developer Tools, which enables you to see the files, the HTML, CSS, JS, JavaScript that make up a web page. Well, it so happens that if you use Developer Tools on Wordle, do a search in the right place for any 5-letter word you would expect to see in the database, you will come across a long list of 5-letter words. So in my repository, you'll find a file wordle.txt, and that is simply where I've cut and pasted what turned out to be 2 lists of 5-letter words that I found in the Wordle web page sources. I said on the last slide that Wordle had its logic client-side. I want to emphasize that Genero does not do that. When you're using the desktop client or the web browser client, the business logic remains on the back-end server. The front end exists to render the front end, to render the AUI tree, to render the user interface. So if we look at the above picture, the runtime on the left is on your application server. This is where your code resides and where the business logic is. The front end on the right, which is the Genero desktop client or the Genero browser client, it renders what we call the AUI tree, which is what the runtime has said to render. The only exception to this is when we get to Genero Mobile. One of the deployment options is to bundle both sides into the one app so that the app can run without being connected to a back-end server. So the hack I did to find the list of Wordle words, you cannot do that with a Genero web application. That information is always held back on the back-end server. So having got the list of words in a file, I'm going to want to read this file and insert it into a database. Genero comes with a number of libraries that give you a lot of functionality. With InformixTechTalk, you might have written C extensions, but here we supply them for you to use as part of standard Genero. To load the data, I make use of two classes. Base.channel to open a file and read lines from it, and base.string tokenizer to split the line based on a delimiter. As I said, Genero comes with a number of packages that have the functionality you need for writing business applications. These include XML, JSON, files, strings, file systems, maths, regular expressions, HTTP requests and responses, some cryptography. If we don't have it, you can import a C or Java library that does. It's not often that you need to go to the step of importing a library from outside, what we supply, but it is nice to have that option there. So with this file of text, I want to put it into a database. Genero has the ability to connect to many database types. It also has the ability to connect to 2 or more databases at the same time. In this example, I used SQLite. With Genero Mobile, this is the database that will be used to store data on the device. SQLite also has a handy in-memory database, very handy for prototyping and small examples, as it can be shared amongst other developers and you'll know it'll work in their environment, rather than worry about them having to create tables on their database. So that is what I've used here. We have added lots of syntax to Genero over the years. There is new syntax that aids performance, both in the memory and the processing speed. Code that helps with code reliability and lessens the chance of sloppy code being discovered at runtime. Ideally, we capture everything at compile time. Code that reduces the number of lines of code you use, so compressing 3 lines into 1, that type of thing. And modern syntax that new developers will be familiar with. Examples I've used in this app that were probably not in the original 4GL: constant, string, boolean, type, returns, in-out, SF, string format, var. These are all keywords that I don't believe were in the original Informix 4GL. I've also included some preprocessor macros to cut down on the amount of coding I needed to do. With web services, it turns out I did not need to, but I did end up creating a web service that can be used to expose the Wordle word. To expose the function, it is a case of adding some attributes, which I've bolded, so the attributes WSGet you can see there, and then including that function in a web service program where we register the web service and then start the web service. With GUI forms, we extend the .per syntax. On the settings screen, here you can see some widgets, in this case, checkbox and buttons. What I've also used is containers to arrange these widgets. So in this case, a VBox or HBox, and groups to put a group text above a group of fields. You should also note that a proportional font is used. And I've also used presentation styles to centralize the appearance of various widgets. With universal rendering, the screen will look the same on the different devices we support. We aren't using native widgets, we're using web technologies to create a universal rendering across all the front ends we support, so desktop, mobile, iOS and Android, and web. I also added some responsiveness into the setting screens. In the demo, I will shrink the screen, and you should note how the two groups, which were arranged horizontally, compress to being arranged vertically when the width is small, as per these two images. The grid container has its roots in arranging 80 by 25 character screens, and still deals in rows and columns. It does not give you pixel by pixel control. It arranges fields next to each other, above and below, etc. My first prototype event for the main screen had 25 one-character labels and 26 plus 2 buttons arranged in 2 grids. It used a menu with 28 actions. This is not your typical business application, and I could not get the keyboard to render how I wanted it to render, as the Wordle keyboard has some interesting overlapping designs. What I ended up using was a built-in web component that we supply called FGL SVG Canvas. It allows you to draw SVG images, and so it gives finer control. You're able to draw clickable lines, shapes, and text elements. There is more coding required when you do this, but you can get more finer detail and more precise results. You typically don't need it for a business application where you've got widgets and you're entering data, but it's good for infographic charts, so it has good responsive properties, and it's good for drawing charts and other various infographics. It also meant that instead of using a menu with 28 actions, I ended up with an input to this web component field and one action, which is in response to a click, where the letter is the parameter to this action. Within the repository, you will see at least 2 apps. Wordle_grid was my initial prototype where I got the game logic right. Wordle_canvas was where I started to use FGL Canvas to get the better and more accurate user interface rendering. So here's Wordle text, which is my file I've copied and pasted out of the web-based Wordle. And what I'm going to want to do is load that up into a database and file. So at the beginning of my programs, if I look through, one of the first things they do is connect to my in-memory SQLite database, and then they initialize and populate the database. So if I just go to the simple definition for these functions, this is where I create a table, create my indexes, fairly standard stuff, and then the next function is where I start to populate it. So here I have what's called a base.channel class, where I've created a variable of type base.channel, then I open the file, and then I read the 2 lines that are in my file. And then I make use of another class called string tokenizer, which delimits that string based on the comma. So there's my string, there's my comma. And I just go through looking for if there's more instances of strings, delimited strings in that line, or what we call tokens in the code here, and find them, and then for each one I then insert it into my database. So this very simple code here is all that's going on in terms of creating my database and then reading through this file to populate my database. An example of a web service exposing a function. So I've got this function which returns today's Wordle, and all I need to do for a web service is add some attributes. So what type of web service it is and what the name of the web service is in this instance. It's a very simple example. And then I just need to create a little wrapper program which is tasked with registering the web service and then starting the web service. So if I'll just copy this URL because I'm going to need this in a second. So if I start this program, so I'll just set it to none so I don't get any GUI. That's my web server started. And now if I go into my browser and type these URLs, if I just click through there, that's calling my web service and getting some random Wordle words. And if I wanted today's Wordle word, spoiler alert, then I've also got that web service there. So you'll see I would have had 2 web service functions, today and random Wordle word. So that's what's going on there. It's very easy to create a web service to expose a function. syntax that I've made use of within this Wordle application. So if we scroll down right from the top, import FGL to import modules, constants, types, so that we can have consistent parameters being passed backwards and forths. And these can be quite complex. So this is my game state, which I pass all the information, which I use to store all the game information. And then as I scroll down, I'll avoid the GUI commands for now, but this is all we're connecting to the database. Plain. var. So var allows you to define variables temporarily, so rather than as part of a function, define them with limited scope and just closest, basically define them close to where they actually end up being used. Plus equals 1, so I don't think that was in the original Informix 4GL, so again, that reduces the amount of typing you have to do. What else we got? Oh, here I've used the preprocessor. So this is part of the game logic, but to handle the 26 key presses, the buttons for the 26 keys. I didn't want to type all this out for each of those 26 keys, so I've defined it as a macro and used the preprocessor to expand that for the letters A through Z. Again, scrolling through string formatting, SFMT, so string formatter, so a very good utility function to display strings, and you replace the %1, %2 with the appropriate parameter. What else we got here? String format again. I'm just trying to avoid the GUI syntax as well, because I'll talk about that later. Well, this is something interesting here. So we've got chaining. So that's using classes, you're able to chain them together, so you don't have to create intermediate variables. Here we've got a select where, as well as the dollar, which you can use to indicate that it's a variable, you can also use ampersand now to indicate that it's a database column, which is kind of handy. Returns. This is one of the things that improves code reliability, because we're actually explicitly stating that this function is returning a Boolean. So if you attempt to use it without returning a Boolean, you get a warning at compile time rather than at runtime. In out, so this enables us to pass records by reference. So rather than putting a whole record onto the stack and popping and pushing it off the stack, push onto a stack, pop off, you're able to use in out so that you're only passing a pointer around, putting a pointer on the stack, so making things that improves the performance. This is initializing a variable. So rather than having a line to define a variable, then another line to initialize it, you can set an initial value as part of the define statement. So that's just a quick look through the code and some of the new syntax I've used. Notice also I'm using Genero Studio, so I'll just point out a few things. So I've got the code structure on the right, so I can quickly navigate between functions and see what's there. We've got, typical for a code editor, real-time syntax or code completion. That's the one I'll show first. So DE, what else can occur at this point? Control space, so declare, defer, delete. If I'm using records, then let, or even with import 4GL, let Wordle.db. I've got the two functions that are there. Offers, and formatting, symbol definition. So if I can click on that, right click, symbol definition, and that'll should take me to where it's defined. What did I do wrong? Yeah. That's where it's gone there. So that was working right. What did I do up here? It's in a let. It's not cool. In fact, there's an example. Look at what it's trying to tell me. It's telling me that it's invalid syntax at this point, because that's not really what I should be using a let for. I should be using a call at that point. So there the symbol, so there the error disappears. So that's another interesting thing, is that real-time syntax highlighting occurs so that you can verify that your code is correct. So I'll show that again, do a simple example. Let x equal 1, I haven't defined x, so it's telling me that there's an error. And if I go down to the document errors and double click on it, it's going to take me to that point. So Studio is very good. I find it very good. I use it all the time. It's been a long time since I've used any other GUI IDE. And anything else I want to show there? Oh yeah, perhaps I could show the debugger. So if I click on there, so that's going to stop at that point. So I'll run this program. Which program am I running? I'll make sure I'm running the right program, and it will be to GUI. So click on the debugger. It's stopped at that point. Get that out of the way. Then I'm going to step into it, iterate through, and define. That's going to be a big variable. I'll get down to where we've got a smaller variable. Yeah, the let L underscore index. So if I find L underscore index there it is there. And if I continue to next my way through, I'm looking for L under, that's the line I'm going to want to stop on. So if we notice L underscore index is 0, then I'm going to go through this line and it's going to change to 1 and it's red. So that's a little quick tour around Genero Studio. So yeah, as I said, it's a very good tool. I use it all the time, and I can't believe people still work in terminal editors with VI. I'm going to use the settings screen to show you some of the new GUI syntax for forms. So that's Wordle settings.per, and if we look at the form, we can see we've got some containers, so HBox and group and grid, and then we've got our widgets that you're perhaps familiar with from your screen. In fact, the first thing to note actually is the word layout at the top. That tells me we're using the new GUI syntax. So here we've got our spacing for our various widgets. When we go down and look at the widgets, we see that on the left here, we've got these syntax to tell us what type of widget it is. And then on the right side, you'll have various attributes for the various widgets. So typically styles, but in this case labels, got the text attribute. So basically when you're coming along to make a form GUI, you're compared to Informix 4GL, you're adding the widget type and you're adding extra attributes. And then once you've got all your widgets, then you're typically grouping them together. So here I've got an HBox with 2 groups with grids. So when I run my Wordle program, I'll quickly go to the settings screen. Here we can see our screen with our GUI widgets and our buttons. What we've also made use of is presentation styles to centralize the look and feel or how things look. So rather than using 4GL, you would have had things like attributes red, attributes bold. Here we use presentation styles. What that means is that in the form, we're giving the various widgets a style, and then somewhere we will find a 4ST, which is where we say or give the various properties to each of those styles. So here's the label comment. So here I've said font weight is dim and the font size is 0.08. So if we go back and look at the form again, these font sizes are 0.8 of what we was. And so we've centralized that in a style. So that's probably the key things with the GUI syntax. You've got your presentation styles, but we've also got adding the syntax for the widgets and their attributes, and then arranging in containers within your form. And then you get nice looking GUI screens like this. So you can imagine a typical business application. You can have more widgets, probably have lots more edits. Probably also going to use tables, which I don't display in this app, but you get nice looking business application screens. I like doing this example, so I'm going to run my Wordle application on lots of different devices, just to show you that universal rendering looks the same on all of them. So first one, desktop. There we are, it's running in the GDs in our desktop client, the GDC. Right, now I'm going to go and switch into my web configuration. Now I'm running in a web browser. And I'll switch to my iOS configuration, or simulator, not the iOS simulator I want. Next one down. And where's my simulator? There it is. And finally, Android. Now if I can bring those all back to the front. Simulator. Desktop client. So I've got it running twice. I'll just get rid of one of them. 1, 2, 3. Which one am I missing? Browser. So there we are. There's the 4 of them running in the same time. And hopefully you can see that they all look the same. And that's the beauty of universal rendering, is it makes it look the same no matter what the device is. And then with our responsiveness as well, then you know the size is responding as appropriate. One of the key things we added in Genero 4.00 was the concept of responsiveness. We can see this with the settings screen. I've put in some responsiveness properties. So as I shrink the screen, you watch the 2 groups. Eventually, there we are. They've started to render vertically instead of horizontally. So that's an example of our screen responding to a change in the width. So the code for that is just in the form definition. Here's our HBox, and we've said when we detect that the screen is small or medium, then we're going to make the HBox vertical instead of horizontal. So that's a short example of some of the responsiveness we've added into the forms. Actually, there's one more thing I should show there. And that is that the widgets also stretch a little. Yep. It's in my project. I initially started off with a prototyping using a grid. It's consisting of our 25 labels, and our 26 or plus 2, 28 buttons for my form. So that looks like your Informix 4GL screen, but with the addition of your labels and the various attributes I just mentioned. So when I ran that, it was good to prototype the game. I could come along and type various words, but it didn't really look. I wasn't happy with the arrangement of the keyboard, and that's really more an artifact of the way Genero forms are arranged in rows and columns. They're not equal rows and size rows and columns, but they are still arranged rows and columns. And because these overlap across multiple columns, I couldn't quite get the rendering I wanted. So that's when I investigated using what we call FGL SVG Canvas, which is an example of a web component which we supply with the product. So now when I run the screen, on this screen with webs, I get a much better looking screen that looks closer to how I want it to. And if I move things around, you notice it's also responsive and changes accordingly. So I was much happier with that rendering using FGL SVG Canvas. So that takes a little bit more coding. And so when I started using it, I parked that Wordle grid and then copied across and used everything in Wordle Canvas and just kept that Wordle grid there as a snapshot of where I was. So Wordle Canvas, if we look on the code, to draw the game board, there's a bit of code that's going on in there, but not too much code actually. Using the FGL SVG Canvas library to create an entry and then add some styles and then draw what in this one? So you have 6 rows or 7 rows, or however many it is, and 5 across to draw that as part of the game board, and then to draw the keyboard. A little more complex, but again, just adding rectangles and text nodes to produce my keyboard, and then 2 special keys at the end for enter and back. So that means the form is very simple because we've just got our web components on them, but a lot of that functionality has been moved to the 4GL to manage the drawing of the rectangles and the text elements. It also meant that my inputs to my dialog statement became an input. So having input a name on the word keyboard, because that's where the what key had been pressed is coming back in through that. It's been managed through that web component. Whereas my original Wordle underscore grid, let's turn, that had a menu statement because we're just reflecting the fact that I'm pressing 26 or 28 keys. So that's just a menu. There's no data entry of a field. Whereas actually, if we look at the word settings.4gl, that's more your typical input. You got your input by name on your records. So Wordle.canvas did end up being a input because we were importing something from our web component. So that's sort of how that all fitted together. As I said, SVG Canvas gives you a lot of control. You know, I can draw these rectangles where I want them and the colors I want them, etc. But it takes a little bit of extra coding to do that, as opposed to a normal business application form. Then you're using your .per for your form to arrange your various widgets. Actually, just by actually playing the game through to its completion. Spoiler alert for those who, I know it's probably a different word by the time because you're watching a recording, so probably okay. It's probably yesterday's or the day before's word by the time you see this. So yeah, just tapping on my keyboard. So that's an input statement being processed by the on action in the input statement. This is just another button. That's when it's going off and doing its checks as to how many you've got right. And then it's up to the user. Then also interestingly, yeah, back works. And then I take a lucky yes. And little dialog button coming up just like in the Wordle game. So yeah, that's the little Wordle application as it runs through. Running in Genero. There is more work for me to do on this app. I can use FGL SVG Canvas again to create a chart. So, you know, when you finish your Wordle, you get that nice chart showing how often you've got it in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 guesses. I should make the database permanent so that I keep statistics, and that'll go into the input for that chart. And then I should add or investigate how to add the share functionality, because that's what makes Wordle popular, is the ability for people to share their results. So I'm looking at exactly how Wordle does that. And then I'll probably be ready to bundle it up as a Genero mobile app. So that's what I think I've still got to go on that project. So keep an eye on the repository. I'll hopefully add more to it over the next few months. So in summary, using Genero and your 4GL skills, you could have written an application such as Wordle. And you can also write GUI applications that look like good GUI applications, not your text user interface screens that you might be used to in your Informix 4GL world. If you want to see more of what you can do with our screens, I'd encourage you to look up one of our presentations from our last year's WWDC. So the URL's on that page, and it's Morgan's presentation, Adding Responsiveness to Genero's Screens. And I think some of those screens there are quite powerful. You can hopefully see there you've got images, web components, and it's responsive and it looks good on all our different platforms. So thank you. I'll now answer some questions if there are any.